Case 1. Stephen McDaniel. On June 30th, 2011, a local news camera in Macon, Georgia, framed a young man sitting calmly on a patch of grass outside his apartment complex. Stephen McDaniel had agreed to an on-air interview with WGXA News. He wanted to speak publicly about his missing neighbor, Lauren Giddings, the law school classmate who had disappeared 4 days earlier. McDaniel played the role of concerned friend. He spoke softly. He appeared composed. Then the reporter mentioned that police had just recovered a body from the apartment complex dumpster. McDaniel's face collapsed. His jaw slackened. His eyes emptied. The moment was recorded and broadcast repeatedly in the hours and days that followed. It would become one of the most widely viewed images in modern true crime coverage. The man sitting in front of the camera had not only known Lauren Giddings, he had killed her, dismembered her, and disposed of her body in that same dumpster. Stephen Mark McDaniel was born on September 20th, 1985, in Lilburn, Georgia. He was the only child of Mark and Glenda McDaniel, a quiet suburban couple who had raised him with careful attention. McDaniel performed well academically and graduated high school with strong credentials. He enrolled at Mercer University and eventually at the Mercer University School of Law, where he was set to complete his JD in 2011. He had no professional experience, no income of his own, and was financially supported throughout his education by his parents. He was single and had never maintained a romantic relationship. Neighbors and classmates at the Barristers Hall apartments, a student housing complex adjacent to Mercer, knew him as eccentric. He sometimes wore chainmail armor. He occasionally walked the halls in a cape. The consensus was that he was odd, but harmless. His record was clean. No one who interacted with him casually had reason to believe he was capable of violence. Lauren Teresa Giddings was 27 years old. She had just graduated from Mercer Law and was studying for the Georgia bar exam, which she was scheduled to take within weeks. She lived alone in a ground floor unit at Barristers Hall, directly next door to McDaniel. Lauren was the daughter of Bill and Karen Giddings of Maryland, and the beloved sister of several siblings. She had attended Agnes Scott College as an undergraduate, where she had been a varsity athlete. Those who knew her described her as outgoing, generous, and intellectually formidable. She had spent years preparing for a legal career and was weeks away from sitting for the exam that would launch it. For months before the murder, McDaniel had been watching her. On June 25th, 2011, he used a digital camera to film through her bedroom window. In the early morning hours of June 26th, 2011, at approximately 4:30 a.m., he entered Lauren's apartment using a master key he had obtained as a resident of the complex. Lauren was asleep. McDaniel strangled her. He left the body inside the apartment and returned the following day. On June 27th, he dismembered her in her own bathtub using a hacksaw he had purchased days earlier. He disposed of the torso in the complex's trash compactor. He carried other remains to dumpsters on the Mercer campus. He bleached both apartments. He then inserted himself into the search effort, calling friends, expressing concern, and eventually agreeing to the live television interview that would end his concealment. The motive, investigators concluded, was sexual obsession. Lauren's friends reported her missing on June 29th, 2011. The next day, officers searching the complex discovered her torso in the trash compactor. The Macon Police Department began canvassing the building. McDaniel was among those interviewed. His demeanor during a 12-hour interrogation was unusual. He sat motionless for extended periods. He did not eat, drink, or request a break. Investigators found his affect disturbing enough to focus their attention on him. A search of his apartment recovered hacksaw packaging, the master key, and a digital camera that contained deleted footage of his surveillance of Lauren. Officers also noted fresh scratches on his body. On July 1st, 2011, he was detained on an unrelated burglary charge. Prosecutors used the interval to build the homicide case. Stephen McDaniel was charged with felony murder. Bibb County District Attorney David Cook announced that he would pursue the death penalty. Defense attorney Franklin Hogue represented McDaniel, who was held without bond. The case did not proceed to trial. On April 21st, 2014, McDaniel pleaded guilty to murder in Bibb County Superior Court before Judge Howard Sims. As a condition of the plea agreement, he was required to recount the murder in open court. He did so without emotion. At the sentencing that followed, Lauren's father delivered a victim impact statement describing the brilliant future his daughter had been building and the devastation her death had inflicted on the family. Judge Sims imposed a sentence of life in prison with the possibility of parole. In the years since, McDaniel has filed multiple habeas corpus petitions alleging that his plea was improperly obtained. Each has been rejected. Stephen McDaniel is 38 years old. He is incarcerated at Hancock State Prison in Sparta, Georgia, where he will remain until at least 2041, his earliest possible parole date. Lauren Giddings' family established the Lauren Giddings Endowed Scholarship at Agnes Scott College to honor the daughter whose legal career was stolen before it began. The live television footage of McDaniel collapsing on camera as his cover-up disintegrated remains one of the most startling moments ever captured in a homicide investigation. Case 2. Kelly Cochran. In a small town in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a rumor took hold that has never been definitively laid to rest. The rumor concerned a neighborhood barbecue hosted by Kelly and Jason Cochran in the fall of 2014, and the source of the meat the couple had served to their guests. By the time the rumor reached investigators, Kelly Cochran had already killed her lover, Christopher Regan, helped her husband dismember him, and disposed of his remains in the surrounding woods. Whether she served those remains to her neighbors has never been proven in court. What prosecutors did prove was a murderous pact between a husband and wife, carried out with chilling efficiency in the town of Caspian. Kelly Marie Cochran was born on June 5, 1982, in Merrillville, Indiana. She grew up in a working-class household, graduated from high school, and pursued no higher education. She worked a series of blue-collar jobs through her 20s. She married Jason Cochran, a man who shared her appetite for secrecy and control. The couple had no children. They eventually relocated to Caspian, Michigan, a town of fewer than 1,000 residents, where they rented a modest home on a quiet street. To the neighbors she met there, Kelly kept her voice low and her manner unobtrusive, the kind of woman whose presence registered only after repeated interactions. She attended community gatherings. She never drew attention. Nothing in her background suggested danger. What no one outside the marriage knew was that Kelly and Jason had entered into an agreement. If either one had an affair, they would kill the person the affair was with. The pact was not theoretical. It would be honored in blood. Christopher Regan was an Air Force veteran who had served his country before settling into civilian life in the iron mining industry of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. At 53, he was divorced and had adult children who loved him. Colleagues at the mining company described him as dependable and steady. He had moved into a home near the Cochrans, and over the following months had struck up an affectionate relationship with Kelly. What he believed was a private romance with a lonely woman was in fact the opening act of his own murder. On October 14, 2014, Kelly invited Regan to her home under romantic pretense. Regan arrived expecting a private evening. Jason Cochran was waiting. As Regan crossed the threshold, Jason shot him in the back of the head with a rifle. Regan died immediately. Husband and wife then dismembered his body, using a reciprocating saw. They loaded the remains into the trunk of a vehicle and dumped them across multiple sites in the woods surrounding Caspian. They cleaned the house thoroughly, scrubbing the surfaces where Reagan's blood had pooled. Kelly then drove Reagan's car to a park-and-ride lot and abandoned it, making it appear he had traveled somewhere of his own accord. Reagan failed to report for his shift at the mine the following morning. His colleagues, knowing his habits, grew concerned quickly. They contacted authorities. The Iron River Police Department assigned the case to Detective Laura Frizzo, who would spend the next year untangling the lies Kelly Cochran repeatedly offered. Frizzo secured a search warrant and executed it on the Cochran home. Inside, officers discovered a concealed panel that had been installed to cover blood-stained flooring. A subsequent covert operation located the rifle used in the murder. By then, Kelly and Jason had fled to Indiana. Shortly after their arrival there, Kelly killed Jason. She poisoned him with prescription pills and then smothered him while he was unconscious. She was arrested on April 28, 2016, in Kentucky. Kelly Cochran was charged in Michigan with homicide, conspiracy to commit dead body mutilation, and concealing a death. Her trial began in early 2017 in Iron County before Judge Richard Salello. Her defense attorneys argued that Jason had coerced her into participating in the murder, citing a pattern of abuse within the marriage. Prosecutors countered with evidence that Kelly had lured Reagan to the house, helped dismember his body, cleaned the scene, disposed of the car, and later killed her husband to silence the only other witness. The jury convicted her on all counts in May 2017. The court sentenced Kelly Cochran to life in prison without the possibility of parole for Reagan's murder. She was subsequently tried in Indiana for the murder of Jason Cochran and received an additional 65-year sentence there. The rumor about the barbecue persisted in Caspian long after the trials ended. Investigators pursued the allegation, but were never able to substantiate it with physical evidence that could be presented to a jury. The possibility remains part of the folklore of the case. Kelly Cochran is 43 years old. She is serving 2 consecutive life terms between Michigan and Indiana, with her primary incarceration at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Christopher Regan's family buried a man who had served his country and worked his way to a stable life, only to be executed by a woman he believed loved him. His adult children were left to explain to their own children that their grandfather had been killed by his girlfriend as part of a marital agreement no one else had known existed. Case 3. Neil Zumbberg. For 15 years, Neil Zumbberg had been keeping score. He had documented the white-tailed deer that crossed his yard. He had tracked the neighbors who fed them. He had blamed those neighbors for the Lyme disease that had taken his career. On the afternoon of May 5, 2014, in a split-level home in New Brighton, Minnesota, he settled the score. He raised a 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun, pointed it through the basement window of his own house, and opened fire across the yard at the couple who had been feeding the deer. At 57, Neil Curtis Zumbberg was a former structural engineer who had been out of work for some time. He had been married to his wife Paula for decades, and the couple had raised adult children together in the quiet Minneapolis suburb where the feud unfolded. Born in 1957, he had trained for a technical profession and had held it for years before losing his position. To casual observers, he was a standard suburban father. Inside the marriage and within the walls of his home, a different man had been developing. Zumbberg had contracted Lyme disease years earlier, a condition he blamed on ticks carried by the white-tailed deer that frequented the neighborhood. The deer had been drawn to the yard across the street, where the couple living there fed them. Zumbberg's resentment of that couple grew with every tick and every symptom. He began keeping notes. He began calling police. He began loading a gun. Todd Stevens, 46, was a construction worker who had lived for years with his partner, Jennifer Cleven. Together, the two had built a life in New Brighton and had developed a fondness for the deer that passed through their property. They had fed them, they had photographed them, they had considered the wildlife part of the appeal of their home. Neighbors described Stevens as easygoing. He and Cleven had attempted at various points to diffuse the tension with Zumbberg, but the hostility had only deepened. In the days leading up to May 5, 2014, the situation had escalated further. Stevens and Cleven had called police on Zumbberg's adult son after a confrontation. The Zumbberg household took the call as a declaration. That afternoon, Paula Zumbberg walked into the yard and confronted Stevens and Cleven, shouting accusations across the lawn. Stevens and Cleven came out of their home to respond. From the basement window of his house, Neil Zumbberg raised the pre-positioned shotgun and opened fire. The first blast struck Stevens in the torso. Stevens collapsed. A second blast wounded Cleven. Stevens died at the scene. Cleven, severely injured, crawled to a phone and called 911. Zumbberg did not flee. He remained inside the house, the shotgun still in the window, until officers arrived and took him into custody. The investigation was swift. The weapon was recovered from the basement window, where Zumbberg had positioned it. Surveillance footage captured by cameras both households had installed during the feud documented the sequence of events. A decade of police reports detailed the escalating disputes. Zumbberg was charged on May 5, 2014, with first-degree premeditated murder and attempted first-degree murder. Paula Zumbberg was separately charged as an accomplice. The trial began in August 2015 in Ramsey County. Judge Margaret Marinin presided. The defense argued that Zumbberg had acted in defense of Paula, who had been in the yard when the shooting began. Prosecutors countered with the detail investigators had found most damning. The shotgun had been preloaded and positioned by the basement window long before the confrontation. Zumbberg had not responded to a sudden threat. He had waited for a pretext. The jury convicted him of first-degree premeditated murder and attempted first-degree murder. Paula was convicted of aiding an offender. Judge Marinin sentenced Neil Zumbberg to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She addressed the defendant directly from the bench, describing the murder as a calculated act born of obsession. Paula received a separate sentence. Jennifer Cleven, who survived her injuries, delivered a victim impact statement describing the terror of that afternoon and the decade of intimidation that had preceded it. Neil Zumbberg is 68 years old. He is incarcerated at MCF Rush City in Minnesota, where he is serving a sentence with no mechanism for release. Todd Stevens was killed because he fed deer in his own yard. The 15-year feud that preceded his death has become a textbook entry in Minnesota policing manuals on domestic escalation warning signs, cited in training materials distributed to officers who respond to repeat neighborhood complaints. Case 4. Michael Vilkin. Michael Vilkin carried a .44 Magnum revolver to a gardening task on the morning of March 28, 2013. He had arrived at his vacant lot in Encinitas, California, to cut back the brush along the property line. He knew the neighbor on the other side of that line valued the brush for privacy. He knew the argument that would follow. He had brought a weapon large enough to end it. Within an hour, an Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker would be dead, and a retired economist would be standing over his body holding the revolver. A Bulgarian immigrant who had come to the United States decades earlier. Vilkin had built a career as an academic economist and had eventually earned a PhD in the field. He was 61 years old at the time of the killing. He had retired by the early 2010s and had acquired a vacant residential lot in Encinitas, a coastal community north of San Diego. To those who encountered him in the neighborhood, he seemed a harmless eccentric an intellectual figure who occasionally appeared on the lot with a hat and work clothes, tending to whatever caught his attention. He had no violent history and no criminal record. The neighbors who would later testify about him used words like quirky and odd, never menacing. A documentary filmmaker whose work on Romanian orphanages had earned him an Emmy and widespread respect within the humanitarian community. John Upton was 56 at the time of his death. His most significant films had focused on the institutions of post-Ceausescu Romania, where he had documented the suffering of abandoned children and had helped facilitate the rescue and adoption of many of them. He was survived by his partner and by his brother. His Encinitas home sat beside Vilkin's empty lot, and the untrimmed brush that had grown along the shared boundary had, for Upton, formed a welcome natural screen between the two properties. That afternoon, Vilkin arrived at the lot and began cutting the brush down. Upton emerged from his home to protest. The two men argued. Witnesses in adjoining houses could hear the voices rising. At some point during the exchange, Vilkin drew the concealed .44 Magnum revolver he had brought with him. He fired once, striking Upton in the abdomen. Upton fell to the ground. Vilkin walked closer. He fired a second round at point-blank range into Upton's head. Upton died within moments. The only object in his hand was his cell phone. Neighbors who had heard the shouting began recording the aftermath on their own phones before police arrived. Several called 911. Officers responding to the scene found Vilkin still present, still holding the firearm. He told responding officers that Upton had drawn a gun on him and that he had fired in self-defense. No second firearm was ever found. The cell phone was the only object recovered from Upton's hand. Vilkin was arrested on March 28, 2013. He was charged with first-degree murder with a firearm enhancement. The trial took place in late 2014 in the San Diego County Superior Court. Vilkin chose to testify in his own defense. On the stand, he repeated the claim that Upton had produced a weapon. Prosecutors countered with the physical evidence and with the simple observation that bringing a high-powered revolver to a landscaping task was inconsistent with innocence. They argued that the second shot, delivered at point-blank range to the head of a man who had already fallen, was an execution rather than an act of defense. The jury convicted Vilkin of first-degree murder. The court sentenced Michael Vilkin to 64 years to life in prison. Given his age at sentencing, the sentence was effectively terminal. He has pursued appeals in the years since, arguing both that the evidence was insufficient and that the trial court had mishandled his self-defense theory. The appellate courts have consistently rejected his claims. Michael Vilkin is 72 years old. He is incarcerated at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego. He will almost certainly die in prison. John Upton's humanitarian work continued after his death through a foundation his partner helped maintain. Channeling resources to the Romanian institutions Upton had spent his career documenting. The children he had helped rescue as infants, now adults, continue to speak publicly about the man who gave them a future before a neighbor with a concealed revolver took his own. Case 5. John Kenny. On the morning of January 29, 1998, a retired lawyer in Carmel Valley, California, walked to the edge of his driveway with a shotgun and waited. He had lost a civil dispute with his neighbors over the placement of a decorative boulder on the shared easement that connected their two properties. The court ruling had not resolved the matter for him. When Mel and Elizabeth Grimes stepped onto the driveway that morning to survey the property line the court had just affirmed, John Kenny raised the shotgun and ended the dispute on his own terms. A retired lawyer and former state official, John L. Kenny was 78 at the time of the killings. Born in 1919, he had accumulated wealth and the trappings of a respectable late life. including a home in Carmel Valley among neighbors who were themselves accomplished. Nothing in his background suggested violence. To those who knew him, he came across as a refined elder of his community, a man whose professional accomplishments granted him authority. That authority had not translated into victory in the civil dispute that had consumed his final years. He had sued his neighbors over the driveway and the boulder. He had lost. A prominent attorney in his own right, Mel Grimes was 58 at the time of his death. His wife, Elizabeth Grimes, was 55. Together, they had built a life in Carmel Valley and raised adult children. Their home sat beside Kenny's, and a shared driveway easement connected the two properties. The placement of a landscaping boulder along that easement had become, for Kenny, an intolerable provocation. Civil courts had considered the dispute and had ruled against him. For Mel and Elizabeth, the ruling was supposed to have been the end of the matter. They went about their lives. On the morning of January 29th, 1998, Mel and Elizabeth walked out to the shared driveway to survey the property line that the court had recently affirmed. Kenny was waiting. He had concealed himself with a shotgun. As the Grimes approached, he emerged and fired. He shot Mel first. He shot Elizabeth. Both died on the driveway. Kenny lowered the shotgun, walked back to his home, and called his attorney. Neighbors who had heard the shots called 911. Officers from the Monterey County Sheriff's Office arrived within minutes. They found the bodies of Mel and Elizabeth Grimes on the driveway, and Kenny at his home, calm and compliant. The shotgun was recovered. The extensive civil litigation record between the two households established the motive within hours. Kenny was arrested that day and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial took place in Monterey County. Kenny's defense team attempted to argue that their elderly client had been suffering from dementia and was not legally responsible for his actions. Prosecutors countered with the sequence of the crime itself. Kenny had retrieved the shotgun. He had concealed himself. He had waited. He had fired deliberately. He had returned home and called his lawyer. Each of those acts was coherent. Each reflected planning. The jury deliberated and convicted him of first-degree murder on both counts. The court sentenced John Kenny to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to a California prison medical facility where his declining health required specialized care. Adult children of the Grimes family delivered victim impact statements at sentencing, describing their parents as the quiet, dignified people their community had known them to be, and the irreparable hole left by their deaths. John Kenny died in prison in 2000, approximately 2 years after his sentencing. He was 80 years old. Mel and Elizabeth Grimes had spent the last moments of their lives surveying a property line their neighbor could not accept. A retired lawyer had killed 2 people, one of them a fellow member of the bar, over a decorative rock on a shared driveway. The Grimes children have spent the decades since advocating for mediation reforms in California civil courts, testifying at judicial committee hearings about the catastrophic gap between a ruling issued and a ruling accepted. Case 6. Craig Hicks. A cell phone was recovered from the body of a 23-year-old dental student at the Finley Forest condominiums in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. On the phone was a video recording captured in the minutes before the shooting. The recording would dismantle the killer's story. Craig Hicks had told investigators that he shot his 3 neighbors during a parking dispute. The video showed what had actually happened. A man arriving at a door with a grievance that had nothing to do with parking and a rage that had been building for months. An unemployed paralegal student, Craig Stephen Hicks, was 46 at the time of the murders. Born in 1968, he had drifted through a series of jobs before enrolling in paralegal coursework. He was married. He lived at the Finley Forest condominiums with his wife, and in that complex, he had cultivated a particular kind of notoriety. Residents knew him as the neighborhood's self-appointed parking enforcer, a man who confronted other tenants over their use of spaces, documented alleged violations, and filed complaints with management over matters other residents regarded as trivial. Online, he had cultivated a combative presence, posting extensively about progressive politics and militant atheism. Neighbors who interacted with him in person described a bully. A search of his apartment after the murders would reveal an arsenal of firearms. A dental student at the University of North Carolina, Dea Barakat, was 23 and had recently married Yusor Abu Salha, who was 21 and herself a dental student. Yusor's younger sister, Razan Abu Salha, was 19 and a student at North Carolina State University. The three were visiting together at the apartment Dea and Yusor had just made their home. All three were American Muslims who had devoted significant time to humanitarian work, including providing dental care to Syrian refugees abroad. They were at the beginning of their adult lives. Their families and friends described them as kind, generous, and deeply committed to service. On February 10, 2015, Hicks walked to the couple's apartment door and knocked. He was carrying a handgun. When Dea opened the door, Hicks shot him. He then entered the apartment and executed Yusor and Razan with shots to the head. 3 people died within minutes. The motive Hicks offered to investigators, that he had come to argue about parking, would be contradicted by nearly every piece of evidence collected at the scene. Neighbors called 911. Hicks surrendered to police approximately an hour after the killings. Officers recovered the arsenal of weapons from his apartment. Most consequentially, they recovered the video file from Dea's phone, capturing the sequence leading up to Hicks's arrival and confirming that the confrontation had been initiated by the shooter. The video demolished the self-defense narrative. Hicks was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The case did not proceed to a full capital trial. In June 2019, more than 4 years after the murders, Hicks pleaded guilty to all 3 counts. The plea spared the families a trial and foreclosed the possibility of the death penalty. It also ensured that Hicks would never be released. Prosecutors and the victims' families acknowledged publicly that the plea represented a difficult compromise, but one that would deliver certainty. At the sentencing hearing, the court imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Family members of each of the 3 victims delivered statements. The Abu Salha and Barakat families described the humanitarian work their loved ones had been pursuing, the children and careers that would never exist, and their belief that the murders had been motivated by hatred. Advocates had long pressed for the case to be charged as a hate crime, a designation federal authorities had considered but declined to formally pursue at the charging stage. Craig Hicks is 57 years old. He is held at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, with no mechanism for release available to him. Dea Barakat, Yusor Abu Salha, and Razan Abu Salha were killed at the beginning of their lives. Their families established the Our 3 Winners Foundation and scholarship programs in their names to continue the humanitarian work the 3 had been pursuing. Dental clinics abroad have been built in their memory, staffed by students who grew up watching the footage from that apartment and who understood what the 3 had been trying to do. Case 7. Alan Wade. At a candlelight vigil in the East Liberty section of Pittsburgh in February 2014, a crowd gathered to mourn 2 sisters who had been found murdered in their home. Photographs of Susan and Sarah Wolf were propped on easels. Television cameras captured the grief. Among the mourners was a neighbor who spoke to reporters about how deeply the loss had affected him. He had lived right next door to the sisters. He had chatted with them over the fence. His name was Alan Wade. What the cameras did not know, and what investigators would not confirm for several weeks, was that Wade had killed the Wolf sisters himself. He had come to the vigil wearing a pair of sweatpants he had taken from their bedroom after the murders. A transient worker with an unstable employment history and a prior robbery record, Alan Wade was 43 at the time of the murders. He had settled into a home next door to the Wolf sisters in East Liberty, a neighborhood in Pittsburgh's East End. To the sisters and to other residents of the block, he struck neighbors as the friendly local handyman. He waved across the fence. He offered to help with small tasks. He made small talk. Beneath the surface, he was in financial trouble and dependent on illegal drugs. The calculation he would ultimately make and the extraordinary cynicism with which he would perform grief for cameras afterward required no one around him to suspect what he actually was. Susan Wolf, 44, worked as a teacher's aide in the Pittsburgh schools. Her sister Sarah Wolf, 38, was a psychiatrist. The two lived together in a home they shared, and their bond was known to friends and family as exceptionally close. Susan was remembered for her patience with the children in her care. Sarah had built a professional practice treating patients with serious mental illness. They were quiet, steady members of the neighborhood, the kind of residents who noticed when something was wrong on their block. On February 6, 2014, Wade entered the Wolf home. Investigators concluded that he had been admitted by the sisters themselves, whose familiarity with him would have allowed him across the threshold without alarm. Once inside, he attacked. Susan and Sarah were killed through a combination of blunt force trauma and gunshot wounds. Wade then stole their bank cards and their vehicle. In an effort to destroy DNA evidence, he doused the bodies with bleach. He abandoned the sisters' car some distance from the house and used the stolen cards at ATMs to withdraw cash. He used the money to purchase drugs and to pay his rent. In the days that followed, as the neighborhood began to organize vigils and television crews arrived to cover the case, Wade joined the mourners. He gave interviews. He expressed grief. Investigators working the scene recovered a single piece of evidence that would prove decisive. A pen cap had been dropped in the home during the attack, and the cap carried Wade's DNA. Detectives pulled surveillance footage from the ATMs where the sisters' cards had been used. The footage showed Wade making the withdrawals, and in the images he was wearing, clothing taken from the Wolf home, including a distinctive pair of sweatpants that belonged to one of the sisters. The combination of DNA and surveillance left no room for doubt. Wade was arrested on March 5, 2014, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and robbery. The trial concluded in May 2016 in Allegheny County. Prosecutors presented the DNA, the ATM footage, and testimony from neighbors about Wade's behavior in the aftermath, including his appearance at the vigil and his interviews with reporters. The defense offered no credible alternative explanation. The jury convicted Wade of 2 counts of first-degree murder and robbery. The prosecution had sought the death penalty. The jury ultimately declined to impose it and returned a sentence of life. Wade was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The Wolf family delivered victim impact statements describing the women their sisters had been and the particular cruelty of a killer who had performed grief for cameras while wearing the clothing of the women he had murdered. Alan Wade is 55 years old. He is held at SCY Green in Waynesburg, Pennsylvania, serving a sentence that has no parole component. Susan and Sarah Wolf were murdered for a sum of money barely large enough to matter. The Wolf family established a scholarship at the Pittsburgh Public Schools in Susan's name, funding paraprofessional training for aides who work with the students Susan had spent her career serving, and continues to support mental health outreach programs in Sarah's memory. Case 8. Bampumim Teixeira. A text message was sent from a luxury penthouse in South Boston on the evening of May 5, 2017. The sender was an anesthesiologist named Richard Field. His wrists had been bound. His fiancée lay near him, similarly restrained. The message he managed to send to a friend consisted of 7 words: gunman, in-house, serious. Minutes later, police arrived at the McAllen building and entered the darkened apartment. Field and his fiancée were already dying. The man who had bound them, tortured them, and stabbed them was still inside. Armed, he had once held the keys to the building. A former concierge at the McAllen building, Bampumim Teixeira, was 30 when he killed the couple, living in the penthouse he had once helped protect. Through his position at the luxury residential complex, he had developed intimate knowledge of the building's security systems, resident schedules, and entry points. He knew which units housed wealthy residents. He knew when they were home. He knew how to move through the building without attracting attention. By 2017, he no longer held the position, but the knowledge he had accumulated remained with him. He had also accumulated a growing financial desperation. A successful anesthesiologist who had built a career in one of Boston's most demanding medical specialties. Richard Field was 49. His fiancée, Lena Bolaños, was 38. She was a pediatric anesthesiologist who had devoted her career to managing pain in children undergoing surgery. The two were engaged to be married. They had moved together into a penthouse unit at the McAllen building, one of the addresses Teixeira had once helped guard. They were at the peak of their professional lives. They had every reason to believe themselves safe in the home they had chosen. On the evening of May 5th, 2017, Teixeira entered the McAllen building. He used his knowledge of the building's layout and security routines to move unobserved to the couple's penthouse. Once inside, he bound Field and Bolaños at the wrists. For hours, he tortured them. He stabbed both repeatedly. He demanded money, jewelry, and access to accounts. What he inflicted was not a robbery in the conventional sense, but a sustained act of cruelty. At some point during the ordeal, Field managed to access his phone and send a desperate text to a friend before the phone was taken from him. Field's friend called Boston police immediately. Officers arrived at the McAllen building and entered the penthouse, which Teixeira had deliberately darkened. A shootout followed. Officers wounded Teixeira and took him into custody. Field and Bolaños were pronounced dead at the scene. The blood evidence, the ligatures used to bind the victims, and Teixeira's presence inside the apartment established the prosecution's case within hours. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial concluded in December 2019 in Suffolk County Superior Court. Throughout the proceedings, Teixeira behaved in ways that disrupted the courtroom repeatedly. He screamed threats at members of the victims' families. On at least one occasion, he broke into song, singing the Macarena in open court. The court ordered him removed on multiple occasions to allow the proceedings to continue. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, the text message Field had sent, and testimony from responding officers. The jury convicted Teixeira of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The court sentenced Bampumim Teixeira to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The victims' families delivered statements describing the medical careers and the shared life that Field and Bolaños had been building, and the cruelty of a killer who had been granted access to their building through the trust of a profession he had since abandoned. Bampumim Teixeira is 39 years old. He is held at the Souza Baranowski Correctional Center in Massachusetts. His sentence has no parole component. Richard Field and Lena Bolaños were killed by a man who had once held the keys to their building and who had used what he had learned there to betray them. The medical communities in which Field and Bolaños had practiced established annual memorial lectures in their names, continuing the pain management research the two had been pursuing in the specialties that had defined their careers. Case 9, Anthony Sowell. For years, residents of Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, had complained about a smell. It clung to the block. It crept through open windows in the summer. City inspectors had visited. A nearby sausage factory had been blamed. Residents had been told that the odor was a natural byproduct of food processing in an industrial stretch of the city. The explanation was wrong. The smell had been coming from the home of a friendly neighbor named Anthony Sowell, a man who hosted frequent barbecues and was known for offering plates of food to anyone who passed. Inside his home, the bodies of 11 women had been accumulating for more than 2 years. A former United States Marine who had served his country before returning to civilian life in Cleveland, Anthony Edward Sowell was 50 at the time of his arrest in 2009. In 1989, he had been convicted of attempted rape and had served roughly 15 years in an Ohio prison. Upon his release, he was required to register as a sex offender. He settled on Imperial Avenue in a working-class neighborhood in Cleveland's East Side and began building a new public identity. Neighbors knew him as friendly. He waved at passers-by. He hosted regular cookouts in his yard and offered food to residents of the block. The barbecue smoke and cooking aromas became a familiar feature of the neighborhood. The odor beneath them, the one residents kept complaining about, would be identified only years later as the defining sensory evidence of the crimes he was committing indoors. Between 2007 and 2009, Sowell murdered 11 women. They ranged in age from 25 to 52. They were African American women from the neighborhoods surrounding Imperial Avenue. Many had been struggling with addiction. Several had been living in precarious housing situations. Each had been someone's daughter, sister, mother, or friend. Several had been reported missing at the time of their disappearances, but the reports had not converged on any single suspect. The institutional indifference that often shadows marginalized women had allowed the killings to continue unnoticed for more than 2 years. Sowell's method was consistent. He lured women into his home with offers of drugs and alcohol. Once inside, he sexually assaulted them and strangled them. He concealed their remains in multiple locations within the property. In the walls, in the crawl space beneath the floor, in the basement, and in shallow graves in the backyard. The smell that residents of Imperial Avenue had attributed to the sausage factory was in fact the smell of decomposition, and the barbecue smoke that drifted across the block had served as a convenient cover for it. In September 2009, a woman escaped from Sowell's home after surviving a violent sexual assault. She called police. Officers responded to the Imperial Avenue address and were granted entry. What they found triggered one of the largest forensic recovery operations in Cleveland's history. Over the following weeks, crime scene investigators removed human remains from throughout the property. The total count eventually reached 11 bodies. Sowell was arrested and charged with 85 counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, and abuse of a corpse. The trial began in 2011 in Cuyahoga County. Prosecutors presented forensic evidence linking Sowell to each of the 11 victims, testimony from surviving victims, and DNA evidence that tied him to the remains at his home. The defense did not contest the physical evidence, but argued against the imposition of the death penalty. The jury convicted Sowell on 82 counts. The same jury subsequently recommended the death sentence. The court formally imposed the sentence in August 2011. The aftermath of the case reshaped Cleveland's handling of missing persons reports, particularly those involving marginalized women. Survivors and advocates pressed for reforms to how such cases were prioritized and tracked. The city demolished Sowell's Imperial Avenue house in December 2011. The lot was eventually converted into a small commemorative space. Anthony Sowell died in prison on February 8, 2021. He was 61 years old. He had been serving his death sentence at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution, where he had succumbed to a terminal illness without being executed. 11 women had died in his home, while neighbors accepted plates of food from his grill. The reforms Cleveland adopted in the wake of the case, now known informally as the Imperial Avenue Protocols, require missing persons reports involving women in marginalized communities to be reviewed within 24 hours by a dedicated unit, a direct response to the years in which 11 women disappeared without anyone connecting the pattern. Case 10. Charles Severance. For years, a man in colonial-era clothing walked the sidewalks of Alexandria, Virginia, campaigning for mayor on a platform too eccentric to be taken seriously. Voters dismissed him. Local press treated him as a quirky footnote. Police considered him harmless. During the same years he was pursuing his public political career, he was also knocking on the doors of the city's most prominent residents and shooting them dead on their own thresholds. Charles Severance operated as a serial assassin for more than a decade before investigators connected the colonial candidate to the killings. A fringe political candidate who had run repeatedly for mayor and other offices in Alexandria. Charles Severance was 53 at the time of his arrest. Alexandria sits directly across the Potomac from Washington, D.C., and Severance had become a recognizable figure on its streets. During campaign appearances, he often wore colonial-era garb, presenting himself as a figure out of the city's 18th century past. He was widely regarded as an oddity, a nuisance rather than a danger. Beneath the costume, he harbored a grievance of an entirely different magnitude. Years earlier, he had lost a child custody case in the Alexandria courts, a loss he considered a profound injustice. The grievance hardened into a generalized hatred of the city's professional and political establishment. He came to view Alexandria's civic elite as a collective enemy responsible for the loss of his child. His revenge would unfold over more than a decade. The wife of the Alexandria sheriff and an active figure in the city's civic life, Nancy Dunning, was 56. Ronald Kirby, 69, was a senior transportation official who had spent his career shaping regional planning policy. Ruth Ann Lodato, 59, was a music teacher and member of a long-established Alexandria family. None of the three had any direct connection to Severance's custody case. Each had been selected because they represented, in Severance's mind, the Alexandria establishment he blamed. Nancy Dunning was shot and killed inside her home on December 5, 2003. Ronald Kirby was killed at his home on November 11, 2013. Nearly a decade later, Ruth Ann Lodato was killed at her home on February 6, 2014. Roughly 3 months after Kirby, each victim was shot at their front door with a .22 caliber revolver, loaded with a particular, uncommon variety of rimfire ammunition. Each killing followed the same pattern: a daytime knock, an open door, and an immediate execution. The killer then walked away. For almost 10 years between the first and second murders, the cases were treated as unrelated. Dunning's death had been investigated as a possible robbery gone wrong. Kirby's, a decade later, had appeared to be an isolated tragedy. Alexandria investigators began connecting the killings after Lodato's murder, when forensic analysis of the recovered ammunition revealed that all 3 victims had been shot with the same uncommon .22 caliber rimfire rounds. The ammunition was distinctive enough to narrow the suspect pool significantly. As detectives pulled records of individuals with documented grievances against the Alexandria courts, Severance's name surfaced. By the time investigators moved toward an arrest, he had fled the country. He was located at the Russian embassy in Washington, where he had been seeking political asylum. He was taken into custody in March 2014. The trial took place in Fairfax County in 2015. venue had been changed to avoid the saturation of pretrial publicity in Alexandria. Prosecutors presented the ammunition evidence, the custody case grievance as motive, and an extensive catalog of Severance's own writings, in which he had articulated violent hostility toward Alexandria's elite. The defense argued that Severance suffered from serious mental illness and was not legally responsible. The jury considered the evidence and convicted him of capital murder on all counts. The court sentenced Charles Severance to 3 life terms plus 48 years. The sentence ensured he would never be released. The case prompted Alexandria and neighboring jurisdictions to re-examine how they tracked individuals with documented grievances against public officials, and how routine the apparent eccentric in a community could be, while concealing a decade of premeditated violence. Charles Severance is 65 years old. He is held at Wallens Ridge State Prison in Virginia, serving an aggregate sentence that eliminates any possibility of release. Nancy Dunning, Ronald Kirby, and Ruth Ann Lodato were killed over the course of 11 years by a man whose colonial costume and fringe campaigns had given the city a reason to laugh him off. Alexandria and Fairfax County have since integrated court grievance tracking protocols into their regional threat assessment programs, a direct institutional response to the decade in which Severance operated undetected.